Today we will have our first student report on Bach. Now, if no one chooses Bach, then there will be a second video of me presenting on Bach. But my PowerPoint will be slightly shorter, and you will need to watch the presentation given by your fellow student on Bach. And we will also be studying the Baroque suite today. Be sure to click on the Bach student report, because most of the information that you will get for the exam will be off of this Bach student report. This information may have been covered in the Bach student report, but these are some things that I found particularly interesting about Bach. First, both of Bach's parents died by the time he was 10 years old, and so he had to go and live with his older brother, who was an organist and a musician as well. So Bach's parents were musicians, Bach's brother was a musician, but he had to go and live with his brother because, as I said, both of his parents died. And he actually learned about composition from his brother by kind of stealing his music at night and copying it. So he would go down, his brother said, "Now don't touch my music, because my music, you'll mess it up." But at night, he would go in and put his fingers through the lattice work where his brother kept his music, and he would roll it up into little, into a little tube and pull it out and take it and copy it at night. So he loved music so much. Number 2, Bach had 20 children. He was actually married twice. His first wife passed away after, say 15 years of marriage, and then he remarried again. But although he had 20 children, only 10 survived into adulthood, because they huge infant mortality rate and lots of illnesses caused people to die before they even became an adult. 4 of Bach's sons became very famous composers during the classical era. Bach lived and died right at the end of the Baroque era, so his children were considered classical composers. His second child, Wilhelm Friedmann Bach, became quite famous. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach was his 5th child. Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach was his 16th child, and he's the least famous today. And Johann Christian Bach was his 18th child. And all 4 of these sons became quite famous composers and well-known during the classical era, and we still play much of their music today. Some more interesting facts about Bach is that he was actually put in jail for almost a month by one of his employers because Bach was looking to take a job elsewhere, and his employer did not appreciate that. And so his punishment was that he threw Bach in jail. But while he was in jail, Bach continued to compose. Didn't seem to be a big deal. He just kept writing organ music. He actually had been working for a duke, wanted to work for a prince. The duke was a little crazy, kind of a weird guy. And the prince, he just thought there was a better place to be employed, and he began kind of talking to the prince and going and doing some playing for some of his parties and writing for some of his events, and kind of trying to network to get into work for the prince. And the duke did not take kindly to that and threw Bach in jail. But then eventually Bach did go work for the prince. So I think the prince and the duke were related in some way, like an uncle or something like that. And so the prince just talked his uncle into letting Bach come and work for him. All right, a second thing that's interesting, Bach was a church musician. And Bach is now considered one of the greatest composers of all time. However, he was thought to be a bit old-fashioned in his day. St. Thomas Church is a place where he worked. They reluctantly hired him when the organist that they offered the job to turned them down. So in other words, they said, "We really want this organist to come. He can't, so I guess we'll have to take Bach." And they were so disappointed. He frequently got into quarrels with the leadership of the church about what kind of music should be played and how the choir and orchestra should be trained. He was quite strict, and he wanted everybody to be playing correctly, and sometimes he might get a little out of sorts with the students. And so they were often in disagreement. But today, now that Bach is famous, St. Thomas actually has a statue of Bach right in front of their church, and they actually exhumed his bones from where he was originally buried and reburied them in the front and center of the church sanctuary. So if you go and you take a tour of the church, in the back of the church you see the organ, in the front you see the pulpits, one on either side, and right between the two pulpits, front and center of the entire church, is the grave of Johann Sebastian Bach. So I guess kind of hindsight is 2020. Now that he is really famous, they want to take credit for having had Bach work there for so long and having been their organist. But at the time, they were not just totally thrilled to have Bach as their organist. Again, they thought he was old-fashioned and a little too strict. So, but now we play his music, lots of his music. I mean, he is one of the most famous composers that we have in history. In addition to watching the PowerPoint student presentation about Bach, be sure you read in the textbook about Bach. And then I also want you to listen to his Prelude and Fugue, and you can find those listening guides on page 156, and then also starting on 157. This is from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. Now, in the Well-Tempered Clavier, Bach was very excited about a new tuning system called well-tempered tuning, which meant that you didn't have to retune the keyboard instrument every time you changed keys. Up until this point, they used exact tuning. Everything was perfectly tuned. And today we actually use a variation of the well-tempered tuning. We use a 12-tone tuning where everything is equidistant apart. But that is actually slightly out of tune. But when they use this perfect tuning system, if you changed keys very far, it sounded out of tune. And so they were trying out this new tuning system, the well-tempered tuning, and Bach actually wrote a piece in every single major and minor key to show how great this new tuning system was, that you didn't have to retune when you change keys. So enjoy listening to this Prelude and Fugue by Bach. If you look on page 160, you'll read about the Baroque suite. A Baroque suite is a set of dance-inspired movements. So, in other words, what happens? The king, the prince, the duke is going to have a party, and so they want to have some music playing after their dinner so that people can dance. And so they would have the composer that they had hired, and he was also, composer-performer, to write a suite of pieces. So there would be an entire set of pieces, and they would have some variety, so they weren't dancing the same dance, multiple times in a row. They were always instrumental. There was no singers because the focus was dancing, and the vocalist would impede the focus on dancing. They felt like. So they were written in the same key, so they didn't feel like they were completely different, but they had different tempos, they had different meters, and they had different character. The first movement was always an allemande, and it was German. Then the courante was always the second movement. It was French. The sarabande was Spanish, and the gigue was English or Irish, like the Irish jig, basically. Suites often begin with an overture that's not for dancing. That's just to call the people together, to let the people know, all right, dinner's about over. We're going to have dancing, so put your dancing shoes on. We're about ready to start. They can also include other movements in case the prince wants an extra long set of pieces for everyone to dance to. He says, I want us to be a long suite, so the composer could include an air, a gavotte, a bourrée. Those were other popular dances of the day, and everyone knew, just like today, if you have a rumba or a cha-cha or a swing or a waltz, you know what steps you're supposed to do. Back in the Baroque era, if there was an allemande, everyone knew the allemande steps. And everyone knew the courante steps and the sarabande steps, and they would dance together. During this time, dancing was very proper. The women wore gloves. You weren't supposed to touch hands. The glove-to-glove thing was about as high intensity as it got. You would dance around each other, but you would never be in hold like you see in a waltz today. Everything would be very, very proper. You would have on your most, regal outfit with the big poofy skirts and the high hair for the women, and the men would have on their fancy suits with ruffles, and everyone would have wigs. And so it was quite an elegant event, and a very kind of sanitary, barely touching each other, just kind of walking around each other and nodding to each other. So so a little bit different from, say, if you went dancing today. On page 161, you will find some listening guides and information about the air and gavotte from Bach's Suite No. 3 in D major. This is a Baroque suite. I did not select all the movements for you to listen to. I just chose two of my favorites. One is the air, and it is the second movement. It contains one of Bach's best-loved melodies and is scored only for strings and continuo, and is serene and lyrical. So again, air is supposed to be kind of airy sounding. All right, very, very light. Then you have the gavotte, which is the third movement. And all the movements that follow the overture in the air are inspired by dance, beginning with the gavotte, which was written in duple meter and in a moderate tempo and uses the full orchestra. And so this one is much more dance-like sounding and lots of fun. So I hope you enjoy listening to these two movements. Bach is considered one of the most famous composers of all time, and the year that he died is considered the end of the Baroque era because so much of his music culminated what was being developed in the Baroque era. And after he died, the classical era began, and we will in fact begin our study of the classical era tomorrow. Be sure that you read in your textbook page 153 through 161. And then tomorrow we will begin the church cantata and the Handel report.